Nvidia have launched their new super version of the RTX 2060, so let's find out what the differences are between the original RTX 2060 and help you decide which you should buy for gaming. Let's quickly take a look at how the RTX 2060 and RTX 2060 Super differ in terms of specs. Note that things like clock speed will vary between specific cards. These are just the reference specs for each model. The Super version has 13% more CUDA cores, a higher base clock speed but a slightly lower boost clock speed. The Super version also has 33% more GDDR6 memory with a higher memory bandwidth. So this could be a better option for those that have been concerned the 6GB in the 2060 won't hold up long term. For the testing, I'm using the Gigabyte RTX 2060 WindForce OC and the MSI RTX 2060 Super Gaming X. So both do have a small out-of-the-box overclock. Expect slightly different results with different models. The system that I'm testing with has an Intel i7-8700K CPU overclocked to 5.1 GHz on all cores in an MSI Z390 Ace motherboard, along with 16GB of DDR4 3200 CL14 memory running in dual channel. You can check the links in the description for details on all of the components as well as for up-to-date pricing. The same Windows and game updates were used for testing, and for drivers I'm using the newest available at the time of testing, Nvidia 431.16, so let's get into the results. Let's start out with Battlefield 5, and I've got RTX off for this first graph. In all upcoming graphs, I've got the RTX 2060 and Super versions towards the top for 1440p and the bottom for 1080p. While all games were tested at the highest available setting levels. In this game at 1080p, the 2060 Super was 12% faster than the 2060 in terms of average frame rate. Then this rose to a much larger 25% higher average FPS at 1440p, where the 1% low from the Super card was now even higher than the average FPS from the non-Super 2060. These are the results once we turn RTX on. And interestingly, out of all games tested, the RTX on results with the newer 2060 Super saw the largest improvement out of all games tested when compared to the original 2060. So I suppose it's good that the Super versions seem to be improving on one of the key selling points of these cards. At 1080p, the Super was 29% ahead of the non-Super, then 33% ahead at 1440p. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested with the built-in benchmark, which I've generally found to smash the CPU more so than the GPU. At 1080p, the 2060 Super was 10% ahead in terms of average frame rate, rising up slightly to a 12% boost at 1440p. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was also tested with the built-in benchmark, and there was a larger difference between the two now. At 1080p, the 2060 Super was scoring 16.5% higher average frame rates over the original 2060, then 18% higher at 1440p, putting it above average out of all games that I've tested. Apex Legends was tested with all settings maxed out, and the improvements with the 2060 Super were on the lower side here compared to most other games tested. At 1080p, there was just a 7% higher average frame rate, while at 1440p, this rose up to a 12% higher average frame rate. Far Cry New Dawn was tested with the built-in benchmark, and this is a test that didn't really see any difference between the two at 1080p. The average frame rate from the 2060 Super was just 0.7% ahead of the non-Super, while its 1% low was actually below the original 2060. However, I'd consider both of these within margin of error. At 1440p, the difference becomes more clear, as the 2060 Super was now 12.5% ahead of the average FPS from the 2060. Fortnite was seeing about average improvements compared to the other games covered. At 1080p, there was a 15% improvement to average frame rate, and a 17% improvement once we stepped the resolution up to 1440p. Either card played the game perfectly fine in my opinion though, even at epic settings. The Witcher 3 was pretty much right on average in terms of improvement with the 2060 Super at 1080p, with a 13% higher average frame rate. At 1440p, this actually lowered a bit to an 11% higher average FPS. Ghost Recon Wildlands was tested using the built-in benchmark. At 1080p with ultra settings, both cards were able to hit 60 FPS averages. However, the 2060 Super was 13% higher in average FPS, and then it had a slightly higher 14% lead once we move up to 1440p. Watch Dogs 2 saw excellent improvements with the 2060 Super. At 1080p, it got the second highest increase over the original 2060 out of all games tested, with an 18% higher average frame rate, with the 1% low nearing the average provided by the original 2060. At 1440p, it's now in third place out of all games tested, with a 19.5% higher average FPS. And this time the 1% low from the 2060 Super was ahead of the average FPS from the 2060. I've tested Strange Brigade using Vulkan using the built-in benchmark, and this game saw an above average improvement with the 2060 Super. At 1080p, there was a 16% higher average frame rate over the original 2060, and then 17% higher at 1440p, where the 1% low from the Super was only just below the average from the 2060. Rainbow Six Siege was also tested with the built-in benchmark, and in this title we're seeing a below average improvement from the 2060 Super, with 10% higher average FPS at 1080p, then a 13.5% increase at 1440p. CSGO was tested with the Euletical FPS benchmark, and is typically a game that is tied to CPU performance. However, I still wanted to test it to see what games that are usually more CPU bound can expect. At 1080p, the 2060 Super was 9% ahead of the 2060, lowering slightly to an 8% increase at 1440p, putting it in last place out of all games tested in terms of improvement with the Super card. In terms of overall improvement, over all 13 tests at maximum settings with a 1080p resolution, on average the RTX 2060 Super was performing 13% better when compared against the original RTX 2060 in terms of average FPS. It really does depend on the game though. With RTX on, we actually saw a massive difference in Battlefield 5, while others like Far Cry New Dawn, Apex Legends and CSGO saw smaller differences. At 1440p, on average over the same 13 tests, the RTX 2060 Super was now 16% ahead of the original RTX 2060. In general, we're seeing a larger difference between the two, as 1440p should be more GPU intensive when compared with 1080p. I'd consider either graphics card to be capable at 1440p in most games too. And again, the best result was with RTX on in Battlefield 5, which is good to see for a product that has RTX in the name. As for the differences in total system power draw, the system with the 2060 was only using 10 more watts while running The Witcher 3 at 1440p with ultra settings. This is 4% more power for a game that saw an 11% higher average frame rate when compared to the original 2060, so that doesn't look too bad. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to accurately test temperatures due to the differences in coolers with these two cards. As a result, my original 2060 was about 10 degrees higher than the Super. It's not an apples to apples comparison as my Super card has better cooling, despite both running at 1871 MHz in The Witcher 3. Now for the final difference, the price. I suggest checking updated prices using the links in the description, as prices will change over time. The original RTX 2060 has an MSRP of $350 while the new Super version comes in at $400. So 14% more money for around 13% higher average FPS at 1080p and 16% higher at 1440p. This doesn't seem too bad to me, at least relative to Nvidia's own lineup. If you want more performance, then you can pay more, and the extra performance seems to scale with the extra money you put in. Realistically, I still think the original 2060 is a great option for 1440p gaming, and it's worth remembering that I'm testing with maximum settings here. So higher than what I've shown is of course possible with lower settings. The extra memory with the Super version could be an advantage in the future though, as more games start needing more. If you've already got a 2060, it doesn't really make sense to upgrade to the Super version. At least I wouldn't personally be considering that as an upgrade path, unless you're able to sell the 2060 for a good price. From what I've seen, the 2060 Super appears to be closer in performance to the RTX 2070. Granted, that's being replaced with the Super version for the same price. Hopefully I can get AMD's new RX 5700 to compare with in future, as it seems to perform quite closely to the RTX 2060 Super in many cases for a bit less money. If you were buying today, let me know which card you'd pick down in the comments and why. The original RTX 2060 or newer RTX 2060 Super. And if you're new to the channel, consider getting subscribed for future comparisons and tech videos like this one.